When I'm drawing in my sketchbook or my journal, I'm normally drawing it for me. I'm not doing something that I'm planning on giving away as a gift or framing and putting on display. So I like to jump right in and do things that are fun and easy and freehand. Now, portraits can be a little tricky, especially if you're trying to get the likeness of the person that you're drawing. This reference image, however, had a couple things going for it that made it easier for me to draw freehand. First off, it's a profile, or nearly a profile shot, and so I only had to worry about drawing a single eye and half of a nose and pretty much half of a mouth. Also, because it's a digital image on my iPad, I can adjust the scale until it's the exact size of the image that I'm planning to draw. If you're working on something that you feel is a little too complicated to draw freehand, or if you're a beginner who's just starting out, please check out my video on perfect proportions using a grid, and I'll include a link to that in the description box below. By laying my iPad directly next to my watercolor paper, I'm able to visually line up each of the features and the important details of the face and really very simply get my proportions and my locations correct. So it makes it a lot easier. If you have a printed version of your image, trying to get it as close to the scale of what you're drawing is usually quite helpful when you're trying to do a freehand drawing like this as well. One thing I believe is important to note here is to pay attention to the way I'm holding my pencil. I start out holding it very loosely and further back on the shaft as I am trying to sort of locate the general position of her face and the shape of her head. And then I start to zero in on the specific location and size of things like the eyes, the nostrils, the lips. And as I become more confident with the scale and location of the elements, I begin to sort of choke up on my pencil, get closer to the tip, and make more deliberate and detailed lines. And as you'll see, I do some erasing on this, and because it's sort of an iterative process, it's very rare that I get the lines in the exact final location the first time I laid them down on the paper. Usually it's sort of a back and forth. And one thing I also want to note is that many watercolorists, in order to avoid having to erase on their watercolor paper or having to disturb the sizing or the finished coat of their watercolor paper before they apply the actual watercolor to it, many watercolorists will create a sketch on a separate piece of paper, and when they're happy with it after they've done all their changes, they will then use that to create a drawing on their actual watercolor paper using a tracing method. So that is just something to keep in mind. It's certainly something that you could do, but in this case, I'm working in my sketchbook and I don't want to get too fussy with it, but I wanted to mention that for people who are considering working on maybe larger pieces or pieces that eventually that you will want to put on display. So I'm going to speed the video up just a bit as I finish up the sketch. You may have noticed that I slid a sheet of paper beneath my drawing hand and that I will sometimes use a clean paintbrush to dust off the debris from my eraser. The reason I do these things is to protect the surface of my watercolor paper from any oils or dirt on my hands and to protect the graphite from getting smeared. Now, I don't take these steps consistently because old habits die hard. So that's why it's a really good habit to form early in your practice. So as I'm watching this, I'm noticing something I'm doing that's probably one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're getting started with freehand drawing. Sadly, this is one of those do as I say, not as I do scenarios, but I do think it's such an important lesson to explain here. What I'm noticing is that my sketch seems elongated diagonally in the direction toward the top right of the paper as compared with the reference. My first thought was to wonder, why am I seeing that now, even though I clearly didn't notice it while I was creating the sketch? Well, here's why. It's an effect called foreshortening. The camera was directly above the iPad and paper, perfectly square with them, so there's no depth distortion. If you're viewing something from an angle as opposed to straight on where it's perpendicular to your line of sight, the shape is going to appear shorter in that axis. When I was recording this, I was doing my best to keep my head out from under the camera, so I was viewing my paper at an angle. My view was from the lower left side of the paper, so the drawing ended up being a little elongated in that direction. To be completely honest, I make this mistake a lot, even when I don't have the excuse of a camera being in my way, because I'm sort of a lazy sketcher. I have the worst posture, leaning my head on one hand while my sketchbook is laying flat on the table. That's a bad habit I'm trying to break. The best way to address this issue is to either use a tabletop easel or even just hold your sketchbook or drawing board so that your view is level and square. Speeding this video up just a bit as I finish my sketch, and on the end I'll show you how I bring it all together with watercolor. So while this video is focused on freehand drawing, I happen to have the video of me finishing up with the watercolor, so I thought I'd throw that in as well. It's 20 times speed and it's not narrated, but I thought it might be interesting to see how this whole thing came together. I hope you found this helpful, or at least a little fun to watch. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and if you're interested in learning more about my online courses or just the materials I use for these projects, please check out my website at bluequarry.com. Thank you so much for watching.